Jesus left that place and went into the region of Tyre. He didn't want anyone to know that he had entered a house, but he couldn't hide. In fact, a woman whose young daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard about him right away. She came and fell at his feet. The woman was Greek, Syrophoenician by birth. She begged Jesus to throw the demon out of her daughter. He responded, "The children have to be fed first. It isn't right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." But she answered, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." "Good answer," he said. "Go on home. The demon has already left your daughter." When she returned to her house, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Humans are a tribal species. Throughout history, the families and societies we've belonged to have provided us with protection, with a sense of identity. They've enculturated us into certain rituals and our tastes of certain preferences. They've helped to form our conceptions of right and wrong. They've taught us who our enemies are. Many have lamented that with the age of the internet, the traditional social structures that humans have depended on throughout history are breaking down because anybody can make a Facebook profile and depict themselves however they want, completely autonomous and disconnected from the morals and expectations and traditions that societies have traditionally grounded us in. But even with the internet, we naturally filter ourselves into groups. Like if you look at my Twitter page, for example, you'll immediately learn that I'm an ESL teacher, a seminary student, that I enjoy hiking, and that I love burritos. These designations give me a place to belong. They connect me to millions of other people out there in the world who have the same designations. The tribes are different, but they're still there, for better or for worse. In this passage in Mark, we witness a confrontation between two tribes, Jesus, a Jew, and the unnamed woman, a Gentile. In this complicated little passage, we catch a glimpse of a tension between these two groups that was still being worked out in the Christian community for whom Mark wrote his gospel. It reflects the complicated relationships of Christians, wanting to live out a new social order but unsure what to do about traditional dichotomies. Before we go on, I have to admit there are several elements to this story which I find quite disturbing. The first springs from the fact that from my 21st century rational realist perspective, I always have a hard time relating to these exorcism stories. Whereas for first century people, a long list of physical and mental ailments could be attributed to demon possession, I'm more likely to suspect other causes. But the exorcism itself remains at the periphery of this story. What's more directly in focus is the conversation between Jesus and this woman, and it's the content of that dialogue that I find really upsetting. I mean, this woman approaches Jesus, she seeks him out, she prostrates herself at his feet, she asks him to help heal her daughter, and Jesus responds with what sounds like a searing insult. "Let the children be fed first, for it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Is that really you, Jesus? The comment sounds so uncharacteristically harsh. He compares the woman and her people to dogs. True, the Greek word that's used here is probably better translated puppies, and it refers probably more likely to house pets than to mangy street pariahs. But neither in our modern parlance, nor anywhere else in the Bible is calling someone a dog an especially flattering thing. It still sounds like an insult. And then on top of that, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that Jesus eventually rewards the woman for what sounds like a rather self-deprecating reply. I mean, as a feminist, I want to shout, wait, no, Jesus. In a world where women have been institutionally subordinated, subjugated, and silenced throughout history, We don't need a story about Jesus rewarding a woman for her humility. A woman readily agreeing that she's no better than a dog is not the model I want the Bible touting for other women to live up to. But perhaps you'll join me in venturing that there's more going on here than just that. At least Mark's original audience probably would have thought so. The passage and the surrounding narrative reflect a dilemma in Mark's community. How to reconcile the fact that a spiritual and social movement that began within Judaism had started to take on multicultural dimensions. Christian Jews and Gentiles, though equally committed to following Jesus, nevertheless clashed when it came to certain customs on which they ordered their lives. And perhaps this was nowhere more evident than in their dining and dietary practices. You see, when it came to table etiquette, Jews had a very specific set of rules. It wasn't just a matter of the kinds of foods they were allowed to or weren't allowed to eat. They also had particular guidelines for how a person was supposed to wash himself before eating. Failure to adhere to these guidelines would make a person ritually unclean. Ritual purity, on the other hand, was the indication that you were part of a special community. It wasn't really a moral issue, but a matter of being a good Jew. It's like when I put my elbows on the table when I'm having a meal with my mom. It doesn't make me a bad person, but I can tell in no uncertain terms from her reproving looks that it makes me a bad daughter. Paul's letter to the church in Galatia helps to illustrate the extent to which table fellowship between Jews and Gentiles was one of the most divisive issues in early Christianity. Writing to the Galatians, he describes a situation in which Jews had refused to eat with Gentiles and condemns their behavior as inconsistent with the truth of the gospel. Since Christianity had started as a movement within Judaism, Jewish customs were regarded as normative. But Paul's scathing denouncement of such behavior highlights that this isn't just a matter of whether Jews and Gentiles are fully in communion with one another. This is a question of superiority versus inferiority. The tension in Jesus' surprising remark about children and dogs cuts to the heart of what some in the early Christian community may have actually felt about an implicit hierarchy between Christian Jews and Gentile converts. That the Jews' ethnic status gave them a position of primacy. But if we learn nothing else from Jesus' descriptions of God's kingdom, we might at least take away that it has a wacky understanding of privilege. In this story, Mark reminds his readers that the overturning of traditional dichotomies finds its source in the actual ministry of Jesus. The passage that comes immediately before this one deals with defilement as not based on one's failure to adhere to rituals, but as a matter of character. In that passage, we see Jesus confronted by a group of religious experts who came from Jerusalem, who challenge him as to why he and his disciples don't follow Jewish tradition by thoroughly washing their hands before they eat. Jesus responds by pointing out their hypocrisy, accusing them of elevating their duty to their tradition above their duty to God. And he teaches the crowds that a person does not become defiled from the outside in, but by the inside out. Evil actions sprung from an evil intent are the only thing that threaten one's standing with God. Gentiles are not, by implication, unclean. And the story of the Syrophoenician woman serves as an illustration of this. But racial divides are not the only dichotomies being challenged in this passage. The woman's reply to Jesus and Jesus' capitulation crosses the boundaries of typical gender roles in first century androcentric culture. The woman is humble in her physical stance and in her addressing Jesus as Lord, but there's an element of defiance in her reply as well. In our shock over the rudeness of Jesus' dog remark, we might miss the fact that the woman wins the debate. This unnamed Gentile woman accomplishes what a coalition of top-tier Pharisees just failed to do. Jesus' comment about the children and the dogs sounds harsh, but it reflects the reality of his situation. He was not an itinerant preacher to the world. He was a Jewish rabbi whose mission was particular to the needs and expectations of Israel. But the woman takes his metaphor and turns it on its head. "Yes, Lord," she replies, "but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." A place at the table is not what she's after. She's not interested in becoming an Israelite. She's interested in a miracle. And she doesn't have to be an Israelite to get one. She just has to be hungry. This is the gospel. This is the good news, that our rightness with God is not measured by how we follow certain rules or fit into certain social categories. We don't have to be ritually pure in order to be fed. We just have to be hungry. It's especially good news for those who fail to meet certain criteria that might otherwise exclude them from the table. The woman may be an outsider by definition, by race, religion, and gender, but here in this passage, she sees as insider access that few others in the gospel are reported to have achieved: a private conversation with Jesus. "Blessed are you who are hungry now," says Jesus in Luke's gospel, "for you will be filled." But what if we're not that hungry? What if we're already on the inside? Already part of the tribe? What then? The church may have long since come to terms with the inclusion of Gentiles in its ranks, but that doesn't mean we've always been very good at putting this reimagining of the insider-outsider dichotomy into practice. Excommunications and witch hunts aside, even the most inclusively minded among us have to grapple with the question, to what extent can we be inclusive without defiling ourselves? We live in an imperfect world, so we need filters. Like an internet search engine, we need an algorithm for making sure the most relevant things come to the top and the distractions don't distract us. From a spiritual standpoint, discrimination has its place. But Jesus says it's not the things we come in contact with that defile us, but our own sinful behavior. The kinds of behaviors that reflect a disregard for our neighbor. Things like obscenities, lust, theft, murder, adultery, greed, depravity, deceptive dealings, carousing, mean looks, slander, arrogance, foolishness, just to name a few. In the words of the Message paraphrase, there is the source of your pollution. Associating ourselves with people whom we consider to be not right will not tarnish our own rightness with God. But the way we treat those people can certainly make a difference. We may understand it differently from the first century Christians, but there's still a sense in which we fear defilement that we might incur if we truly enter into fellowship with those who don't match up to our own idea of rightness. We all have people whom we'd rather not be associated with. You know who I'm talking about. We might tell certain people we love them, but we make it very clear to them and to everyone else who might see us that we don't approve of their lifestyle. Or we feel the need to explain to people we meet, I'm a Christian, but I'm not one of those kinds of Christians. Earlier I mentioned the ways that even in a world of digital, free-floating social media profiles, we find ways to organize ourselves into groups, which has a way of magnifying our relatedness to people all over the world, but it also has a way of magnifying our differences. Social media websites make it easier than ever to announce to the world who exactly doesn't belong in our group. The New York Times published an interesting article just this last week about the growing phenomenon of online shaming, an event in which Millions of people rally themselves around their mutual disapproval of one random person's words or behavior. One example of this is the story of Lindsay Stone, a 32-year-old woman whose friend took a picture of her mocking a sign at the Arlington National Cemetery's Tomb of the Unknowns. While the sign asks for silence and respect, she pretended to scream and flip the bird. Tasteless, perhaps, but if you were one of Lindsay's friends, you might have known that she and the friend who posted the picture on Facebook had a long-standing joke about taking pictures of themselves disobeying signs, smoking in front of a non-smoking sign, for example. But to the online strangers who initially noticed and reposted the video, or the photo, they weren't aware of the context. To them, it looked like blatant disrespect of deceased veterans. Someone set up a wildly popular Facebook group denouncing her behavior, and as a result, she was fired from her job and spent months holed up in her home trying to recover from the trauma. The author of the Times article asks us to ponder, does the punishment really fit the crime? But he also seems to be calling us to ask ourselves, what is it in our tendencies as a species that we could channel such vitriol, such hatred into people we've never even met? As I read this article, I found myself wondering, had I even ever actually participated in something like this? I would venture a guess that it has something to do with our tribalism. We all want to know that we belong to something good. But how do we know that we're in if we can't identify who's out? How do we know if we're right if we can't identify who's wrong? What's amazing about this story of the Syrophoenician woman is that when Jesus brings up this dichotomy between insiders and outsiders, children and dogs, she owns it. Yes, Lord, she says. She concedes that she's not on the inside, but her answer reveals that the old paradigm of insiders and outsiders is crumbling in the face of a new movement inaugurated in Jesus. In this new world order, the bread isn't just for the children. It's for anyone who's standing there, humbly waiting for it to fall into their mouths. We are a tribal species. We know that the people we associate ourselves with say something about us. But Jesus is asking for our association with him to speak the loudest of all. We know we can do it, that we must do it, because Christ does it for us. The incarnation of Jesus Christ is the ultimate example of God humbly associating God's self with a rough and tumble bunch who collectively are so bad at consistently being right. Can we dare to humble ourselves to the point that the bread of the kingdom can't help but fall into our mouths? Can we take the same risk on others that God has taken on us?